So hello, everyone. Thank you for coming along this evening. Apologies again for not being able to make it this morning, but I appreciate anybody who has changed their slots to be able to make it here this evening. My name is Kristy, and I have a master's in Gothic studies. My primary research focuses more on eco-Gothic and ecofeminism, nautical Gothic, but one of the things that I'm really interested in as a secondary research area and that I just really love exploring is children's Gothic. So when I saw the topic of death for the theme of March with Romancing the Gothic, I knew that I wanted to have a look into that in regards to children's literature. So I just have some details up here. You're free to email me afterwards if you have any questions. And that's also my Twitter handle where I post a lot about other papers and such that I'm working on. So as it was already mentioned, there we go, getting back into the swing of things. It's been about a year since I've done this. So as Sam was explaining, today is going to be broken up into 3 parts. So the first section, we're looking at the history of children's, not necessarily even just children's literature, but also children and childhood in general, to get an idea of how children are treated throughout history, and then how that impacts children's literature when it emerges more in the 18th century. Then we're going to be moving into part 2, and that's going to be looking at more of our contemporary literature and having a little focus on hauntology and ghosts, which have been a vital part of children's literature since the beginning, since the origins, before it was even known as children's literature. And then part 3 is going to be on the emergence of YA and future predictions. So I just wanted to mention a few trigger warnings before I really get into it. Obviously, today we're talking about death in children's literature. There will be discussions of death, child death in particular. There is also a brief mention, I just want to put this out there because it's within the first section, there's a brief mention of abortion in relation to the Middle Ages. So just, it doesn't say anything on the slide, but just if you see the slide for Middle Ages and you don't want to listen to that, just hop off until that slide disappears, or take the sound off until that slide disappears. In the third section, there's also a brief discussion of Harry Potter texts. We're not looking at this in reference to the author, nor are we looking at any close analysis of the text or film, but understandably, if anybody wants to hop off for that, again, it's the same thing. The slide will be there and you can just hop off, turn the sound off while that's up. And there was something else. Oh, yes. So there is a clip from Twilight as well. The rest of this is all in the third section, so I will remind everybody, but there's a Twilight scene that I'm showing a clip of, and there's an emaciated body, so be aware of that. I'll flag it when it comes up. And finally, at the very end of the discussion, to just top it off with a nice little positive cherry, we're talking about the current world as it stands today and all of the multiple crises we find ourselves in. But I promise to leave you on a more hopeful note. But just again, if that makes you a little bit uncomfortable and you just want to not engage in that, that's perfectly okay too. But let's get into the fun stuff. So children's literature. Now, I always like to start my talks with a collage of sort of the genres that I'm looking at, and this one was particularly fun to make. I'm sure a lot of you can probably recognize most of the text, and not only will there, as you see here, are there texts, but there's also films as well. Some of them you might seem as more Gothic than others, but largely these ones do scream a little bit in terms of Gothic. But you can see through the range of here how much of a rich, how rich children's literature is, especially in contemporary times when it expands beyond necessarily just the children's aids, but goes into that more young adult category as well. So what exactly do I mean when I'm talking about children and youth throughout this talk? First of all, I want to note that for the purpose of this talk, I consider the definition of children differently at different historical periods. So that's something to keep in mind, especially when it comes to the further separation of age categories in contemporary times, such as with teenagers and young adults. So it's a changing, transformative definition throughout history. And usually for most historical periods, persons under the age of 13 years old is generally considered a child. So this is talking in terms of ancient times, that's around the age of puberty. So this is also defined by a child's legal status as a minor versus an adult, and therefore needing a guardian and somebody to be caring for you and bringing you up and making all those important decisions for you. And finally, in terms of youth and how that differentiates from children, I'm taking this straight from the United Nations, who defines youth as those persons between the ages of 15 and 24 years old. And that's a definition that they've chosen based on various cultures. So trying to move away from just the sort of extended adolescence of Western culture, but seeing how that kind of globalization has clearly had an impact on youth throughout the world. I do want to mention that this talk primarily looks at Western texts. I'm not looking at anything really beyond America and Great Britain. That's not my specialty. I would love to have discussions about it if anybody does know about those different areas and different cultures, but I'm sticking to the Western side of things. Although saying that, I start with the ancient Greeks. So I wanted to start off, when I was first looking at this talk and looking into the origins of children's literature, a lot of the times we gauge children's literature with the Industrial Revolution and the 18th century, and that change in view of children as having their own needs versus the adult. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to go back in time and consider what children were like in ancient times, because a lot of the times I have a feeling we tend to believe that there wasn't childhood as we know it within ancient time, but there was definitely a version of that for their own society. So one of the most prominent things that had an effect in ancient times was the fact that the reality of regular child death is something that is a common day occurrence. And we see this in terms of in ancient Greece, how they delayed welcoming and integrating their infants into their home after birth. So as you see by a quote from Garland here, the child was not integrated into the household, or oika as it was called, for 5 days after birth, lest they didn't survive. And realistically, not many infants would survive those first days. However, this delay in accepting and believing in the new life of a child continued not only within that period, but also extended slightly further by the fact that they didn't give names to their children until the 10th day. So again, sort of stringing along that anxiety of the fact that realistically, the infant wouldn't make it to that point. As many ancient cultures and even current cultures, boys were more sought after than girls. And boys were the ones who were receiving formal education from the age of 7. And that did include going to school. I think a lot of the times we forget that ancient civilizations had these structures in place, not to the same extent, again, as today, but they did exist. And that was dependent on wealth and status, not too different from today's society. So girls married around the time of puberty, and that was around the age of 13, 16. And it's important to note that even though we look at ancient civilizations of having their children immediately be working within the household and contributing to the family, they also had toys. They're really fun to look at too. If you Google some images of ancient Greek or ancient Rome toys, you've got little like clay figurine soldiers with little javelins and things like that. It's, well, spikes, whatever it would be at the time. But they're really interesting to look at. And it just goes to show that there was this playfulness, there was this encouragement to play, especially based on the quality of some of these toys. And it's also interesting to note that those toys were directly related with this childhood, this childness and not being an adult. So for example, before girls married, they sacrificed their toys to Artemis to show it as a sign of maturity and that they were prepared to transition into womanhood. So again, there's this symbolic giving of that childhood to, in this case, the god to then reflect their own development. In ancient Rome, again, all of these civilizations, very high mortality rate for infancy. And a lot of things are quite similar in terms of how children's lives were during these times, but it's very interesting to note in terms of ancient Rome, and it's not just limited to the culture of ancient Rome, but it's suggested that infant exposure was relatively common. And what that means is Bennett describes it as the fact that the Romans themselves thought that from the very earliest of times, the paterfamilias has always possessed absolute power of life and death over all children born into his household. So that is the notion that a father had complete control over whether his child lived or died. And selection was at times unforgiving. Only the fittest survived. And it didn't always mean that an infant was abandoned, which is essentially what that means, is infant exposure. They're left, and the implication is they are left to die. But they're not just abandoned due to sickness. It could be potentially a healthy infant who the father simply doesn't want, especially in times of limited resources, extra mouths to feed. That could be a decision that is made by the father of the household to abandon an infant. And that was legally allowed within that society. So clearly, children had zero rights in terms of their own lives and their own autonomy. They were not seen as something precious to be protected. It was just another resource, and they were relatively expendable, not necessarily always willingly, but they did come and go quite swiftly. So again, in ancient Rome, education is still available, but it's costly, so it's not accessible to everyone. And you have the poor who the poor who will immediately begin working in households and learning kind of the jack of the trade from their families rather than going into education. The discipline was quite strict, especially for boys as they prepared for military service. And then in ancient Egypt, it's a little bit more interesting in my opinion, because Egypt seemed to have a really keen interest in birth, and births were really celebrated. And you can look at how a lot of newborns or infants were given an astrology reading for their future and had blessings bestowed upon them through that for good luck later on. It's also large intergenerational families. So this is important in the sense that the children who are being brought up within the families, it's not just the parents who are having an influence on them, it's also aunts and uncles, because the sons would stay within that same household and the wives would move in with them. So just imagine if you have 3 brothers, you would be, living with all of them under one roof and their wives. That was the family household at the time. So it wasn't uncommon to have 15 people under one roof. Also, mothers did not breastfeed children. This is not necessarily seen in terms of a disconnect between the mother and the child. It's more based off of fear, which when I was thinking about it more, because there's the notion that they feared breastfeeding because it would reduce their fertility or have a negative impact on their fertility. And when you stop and think about it, actually, if you're breastfeeding, you don't have a menstrual cycle, therefore you cannot get pregnant. So at the time, clearly they were making those connections and realizing that, something's not happening as quickly as I would like. And it's also important to remember at the time that women were actively seeking to have as many children as possible, especially because so many didn't survive. So the more you had, the more chance you had at least a few that would survive into adulthood. Again, formal education for boys started from around the age of 7, and girls were taught at home by the family. So they did learn to read and write on occasion, but it wasn't formal, and it would have been just in the home if they did. And although we're hearing about children learning to read and write, their literacy, this was not for the purpose of entertainment. So I think that's another thing to sort of look at in terms of differing from when children's literature comes into play, because this is more for everyday life. This is not for entertainment purposes. And I've just included a really interesting little wax tablet here of a school exercise book from ancient Egypt. So then in the Middle Ages, we also have education that is restricted, and there's a shift from military focus into more of a religious focus. And a lot of, and what was interesting in terms of the Middle Ages is that children were sent off, usually around the age of 14, sometimes as early as 7 or 8, to another household. This is specifically within Britain. They were sent to other households, almost in a sort of foster system, to do the housework for those families in order to prepare for adulthood. And this can be seen as a direct influence of the impact of the Black Death on the working population. So cheap labor was needed, and it was kind of thought that if you sent your child, if you had a stranger's child come into your home, then you could feed them less and work them harder than your own child. So let me see. I'm gonna just skip over the contraceptive bit because I think that's fine. We don't need it. So in terms of child mortality during these times, this is across societies, across times, and the rates are high. And this is true for the large majority of history. It's only in recent history that this has actually been something that has decreased and decreased steadily. So, for example, during these times, usually less than half of the number of children a woman birth survived to the age of 10. So it was something like 75 to 80% mortality rate per family of the amount of children that a woman birthed. So if you had 10 children, you'd be lucky to get 3 that survived into adulthood. That was sort of the ratio that you were looking at. Infant and child death is a common occurrence, and it has been so for the majority of human history. And this is largely due to infection and disease at the time. But again, also, unfortunately, because of practices such as infant exposure and selection, and again, death within military circumstances as well, although those usually were not children. So this, the common occurrence of death within this particular time period almost creates an instinctual disassociation from the child, as we've seen, because the adults only want to invest in a connection with the family household once they're sure that the child has secured a more secured age of livelihood, where it's unlikely that they're going to pass away. So, but when you think of it in terms of the fact that the highest age range in terms of child death was up to the age of 10. So there's only about 3 years before suddenly they're supposed to be kind of moving into adulthood, where maybe a parent, so you can understand the dissociation a little bit that's happening, but that's not to say that the parents of these times did not love their kids, because clearly there is evidence of that. So it's only in the beginning of the 20th century, once we see improvements in hygiene and diet and medicine, that death in childhood has become more of the exception rather than the norm. And this has been reflected also in our attitudes to death that are culturally constructed. So for example, in those ancient times, their culture did not see children as being worthy of that investment, nor did they see them as having a particularly high status within society. Whereas once it starts shifting into the notion of the child and childhood specifically, and the sort of sensitive mind that has, we'll touch on it soon, in terms of a blank slate that we are needing to protect in terms of positive influence rather than negative influence, you can then see how within the Victorian period, the existence of comforting and reassuring stories about child death are clearly influenced by Christian beliefs and that notion that the child is this innocent, pure being, and that death is somewhat comforting in that way. But in terms of the rise of childhood as a period of someone's life, this really comes into play during the Industrial Revolution. Now, the emergence of the modern child is looking here at the different capacities and needs and frailties that the child has versus the adult. So again, it's this innocent child that requires protection to achieve a desirable development into adulthood. So playing on that, there's this idea of a good death for a child during these times. And that is the notion that in dying as a child, the child preserves their purity and innocence rather than being corrupted by the sin of becoming an adult or on their progression to becoming an adult. And we can see this in James Janeway's book called A Token for Children, being the exact account of the conversion, holy and exemplary lives and joyful deaths of several young children. And he was a minister. This was published in 1671, and it accounted the ways that several of these young children died, but it was seen as a joyful death because they died in youth, and therefore they were pure and innocent, and they would be going to heaven most definitely. That was the kind of thought process behind that. But one of the crucial developments within the Industrial Revolutions that really played a role in the creation of, or the formation of, children's literature is the development of the middle class. So this is really the time where that is coming into play. You have a society in which there are people who want to differentiate themselves from the upper and the lower classes, and particularly in terms of separating themselves from the lower class influence in relation to the idea that that can have a negative influence on their children. So again, it's that notion of if they provide their children with the best possible scenarios and the best upbringing possible, then they can have that society, class mobility that they're seeking. So in terms of the middle class is defined by a social group of people who sought to differentiate themselves from the upper and lower classes of society, breaking down the dichotomies of the wealthy versus poor, aristocracy versus commoner. Instead, the middle class sits between the extremes of the upper and lower classes. So the Greenby argues that the new children's literature of the second half of the 18th century was designed for the middle class and for those who aspired to it, because again, this aspiration for mobility is benefited from the rise of empiricism, which are all sort of happening to coalescence into one, which is where we get the emergence of children's literature and how children's literature is used to progress those ideologies, at least in terms of the legitimate, appropriate children's literature. So we will look at now John Locke's philosophy on children, and this sort of brings it all together. So John Locke was a philosopher, and a French philosopher, and he was the one who came up with the idea that the child's mind is a tabula rasa, which is a blank slate void of any thoughts, any ideas, and it is there to be influenced, and the way that a child is raised and what they learn is what's going to create the person that they become. So it's all about external influences rather than any kind of genetic internal situations that are there already. So this is the idea that everybody has the same blank slate, and this helps underpin the ideology of an equal opportunity that further supported the development of the middle classes and suggested that children who would naturally succeed would be those who had received the best education, and who by dint of industrial application had acquired the most useful skills and knowledge. So likewise, this meant that it was crucial to protect children from negative influence, such as the folly of the supernatural. Now we're getting into the Gothic. So the supernatural was seen as something that was to be rid of at all costs, in terms of if you wanted your child to be brought up and to have that useful skill and knowledge, the best way to do that was to avoid anything in terms of the supernatural. So Locke goes on to say that all impressions and notions of spirits and goblins or any other fearful apprehensions in the dark need to be discredited, and the usual awe that is given to them through the storytelling of servants is the reason that these children are continuously having interrupted sort of imaginations and not being able to look at the world with reason. So again, there's this notion of reason versus the imagination, and specifically talking about raw head and bloody bones, so that they have reasons to be afraid of the dark, especially when alone. And one of the crucial aspects of this, specifically in targeting the supernatural and this idea that it's an indiscretion of the servants who are telling these stories, is that this is an attempt to discredit, one, the lower classes, but in particular, it's aimed at the old wives. Now, I'm sure we've all heard of an old wives' tale, and that's, you know, something that is not true and it's a little bit out there. You wouldn't take it with any kind of grain of salt. But in terms of these, in terms of the times that we're discussing, old wives were actually peasant or slave women who typically spent most of the time with children. Thus, they were the ones who there was a specific focus to separate from these children in regards to the emergence of the middle class, because these were the women who were having more of an influence on the children and who specifically were giving storytelling using the supernatural elements and in a distinctly oral fashion. And the oral and the plebeian, according to Grenby, is viewed as inappropriate and illegitimate for the education of children of the middle classes. Therefore, in terms of what society is saying, that I'm sure that scholar doesn't think that herself, just to be clear. So there's a purposeful and considered distancing of the literary from the oral tradition, and an attempt to control and define what is appropriate and legitimate material for children's literature. Not only was the oral tradition considered illegitimate, but it was also deemed as actively harmful for a child's development and later prospects of an adult, as an adult. So for example, there's the notion that if a child is exposed to these stories when they're young, as an adult, they cannot be rid of those stories. They will be continuously fearful. They will not be able to be a level-headed, reasoned member of society. This is going to impact their entire lives. So you can see the sense of fear that might come into play from the families who are listening to Locke's theory. And Locke does have a lot of sway when it comes to this. It takes a very long time for this to start waning out. So one of these texts in particular that comes into play is what is described as potentially the first distinct children's novel. There's some, you know, back and forth over what exactly is the first children's novel, but this is largely agreed to be one of the main texts. And this was published in between 1764 and 66. I found different dates depending on different scholars, which is a bit odd, but there we go. So I've put both of those dates there for that reason. It's called The History of Little Goody Two Shoes. So again, we've got this wordplay that keeps coming in. We've had old wives' tale, now Goody Two Shoes. We know what that is implying. So again, it's this notion of how can, in terms of this, it's really saying, how can you be a goody two shoes? Like you want to be that good, perfect child. And it specifically exposes the folly of imagination riddled with the supernatural. So within the story, the one of the main characters, there's a bell that's ringing from a church, and everybody's starting to panic because there was somebody who was buried the night before. Or who had at least a funeral service the night before. I can't remember it now. But there's a ringing going on. So the first instinct in terms of that supernatural imagination is the person has come back as a ghost. But in reality, it was just another girl from the village who fell asleep in the church, and it was locked. And she thought, if I ring the bell, somebody will come and let me out. So I mean, this wouldn't be a miss necessarily in terms of an Anne Radcliffe novel where, you know, the supernatural is something that is actually more plain and everyday. But it's from the get-go that it's made clear this is not a supernatural element. There is no supernatural context within this. And if you believe that there is, you're a fool, essentially. But they say, you know, within the tale of something that's interesting for a child. So of course, Newberry's book was highly influenced by Locke's ideas of a child's tender mind. And it's interesting too, within when this is published specifically, I found in a chapter by Dale Townshend, he points out that coincidentally, this Newbery book was published around the same time as Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, 1764. So I'm sure that everybody here knows, but if you don't know, Castle of Otranto is the first Gothic novel. Again, you can contest it, but it's largely agreed that it is the first Gothic novel. So at the time that the supernatural and the Gothic is starting to become widespread and popular in adult fiction, that is the very time where it's attempted to be extracted completely from the literature of children, specifically what is deemed as legitimate literature. And I keep saying legitimate because there are Gothic elements, there are supernatural stories still coming out. You have things like chapbooks and penny dreadfuls that come into play, all of these things that do play on these, and there are ghosts still within these stories, but these are seen as lesser than. These are not the books that you want your child to be reading. You want your child to be reading the appropriate, real. It's almost, if you think of today in terms of literary fiction versus romance or something. I'm sorry if you're a romance fan, but there's that notion of there's this thing that people have in their head as a one being better than the other, when it's not. But it's that same kind of play as one type of literature is a better influence than the other. It's giving me more in terms of intellect or within those regards. So we can look at it in terms of some of the genres we have today as well. So the key characteristics of children's literature at the time were, and I'm paraphrasing Granby here, were respectability, rationality, and temperament, or a good temperament. And it also brought in different aspirations from the more aristocracy class. So things such as integrity, reliability, level-headedness. These were all things that we were looking for in children's literature at the time. Those were the qualities that you wanted to see. Those were the qualities that you wanted to instill in your child who is reading those books. Because of course, it's important to remember that children's literature is always controlled by adults. We're the ones who write it. We're the ones who give it to them. We're the ones who buy it. We are controlling their reading to an extent, especially in terms of who's writing the books for children. That does get blurred a bit once you get into YA, because there are people who are of YA, who might be writing for teen or for YA as well. And then you have more of a balanced interpretation of what that experience is. But when it comes to children's books, I don't know any children who have wrote a book. I'm sure that they have, and they're lovely and they're at home somewhere, but you know, it's not a standard practice of children writing books for children. So ultimately, we're constantly trying to influence them in whatever way we write, whether that be with the supernatural and feeling like they need to have a bit of fear and a bit of horror to understand some of the darker emotions of the world, or whether we want them to actually behave and discipline and not talk back to the elders. We are ultimately controlling that narrative. How we move past that, I don't know. So we are then going to move on. Sorry, I lost my place in my notes. So despite the efforts to eradicate the supernatural from children's literature, as I said, there's the diminished influence of oral storytelling, but ultimately Gothic elements still persist in books. Not necessarily the ones deemed legitimate, but they do, especially in terms of Gothic elements rather than the supernatural, because in terms of these stories that are trying to teach children to act a certain way or to foster certain morals within themselves, a lot of the time these books will invoke fear, and they invoke fear by invoking a lot of Gothic elements in terms of the you know, the dark night and the creepy woods, or this in one of them it was a strange man who was approaching, and she was suddenly so distraught by fear because she had this supernatural imagination when really it was just the minister coming to see if she was okay. So again, it's that notion of, oh well, you're being silly, but there is the invocation of the Gothic clearly within even the authors who chaticized it themselves and said that it wasn't appropriate for the books for children. So whatever attempts were being made to police the boundaries of children's literature, many young people were still getting their hands on it, especially in terms of the latter half of the 19th century, when the influence of Locke was finally beginning to wane a bit. And we can see as well that the dark and gruesome is still alive when you consider things such as the publication of the Grimm's fairy tales that's published in 1812. Again, folklore is one of those ones that we have to look at in terms of having an oral based tradition as well. So again, it's naturally coming into that influence if we're thinking of Gothic and supernatural and all that stuff having a really strong oral base. But in terms of Grimm's fairy tales, it is gruesome, it is horrific, but it gets changed a lot. And we know this. There's multiple changes, there's multiple editions that come out, and it goes back and forth for a very long period. The stories are just simply not translated into English because it's not appropriate literature for the children. So it's out there and people are trying to stop it from gaining more traction, but I like to think that you can't stop the Gothic once it gets going. So ultimately, this notion of death being something that is, I wouldn't say revered, but the notion that a child death is to be joyful, and that their innocence is protected, starts to decrease within the 19th century and the 20th century. So in the 20th century, the thing that shifts dramatically is the fact that there is a decrease in infant mortality. So this is when medicine's starting to come into play, hygiene practices are coming into play. And so there's a decreased experience of child death as a daily norm, and it becomes more exceptional rather than an everyday occurrence. So it also corresponds with the decline of death as an appropriate subject matter for the inclusion in children's literature. So previously, because it was something children were quite regularly comfortable with, because it was just part of the everyday, once that starts shifting and death is not so close to children. It becomes something that is, again, a bit more extracted from the literature, and particularly in terms of moralizing stories. You know, you don't necessarily have that joyful explanation of those several deaths by that minister anymore. That's not something that you'll get at this point in time. So yes, so in the, sorry, I've completely lost my spot. There we go. Yes. So in terms of the culture that exists and how we are viewing death, because the culture is having a huge impact on it, when we get to this point in time and the Enlightenment becomes more prominent and there's more questions about the existence of God, there's what is defined here by Davison as a cultural trauma that alienates us from an earlier familiarity with death. And this gives rise to anxieties and uncertainties about mortality, loss, and remembrance. So there's no longer this security as religion is being questioned in terms of, when I die, is that actually going to, am I going to go to heaven? If a child dies, are they actually, was that meant to happen? Is that a good thing to have happened? Or actually, is that not what I believe anymore? So there's these internal anxieties and traumas that are happening within a lot of people in this society, and particularly how they understand and see death. And that, of course, will ultimately transform the way that death is seen in various forms within society. So I'm going to do a little pause there for, I'd probably say about 5 minutes rather than 10 minutes, just because I've got quite a lot of material. But if you have any questions at this point, I would be happy to hear them. I'm just going to down some water, and in 5 minutes, we shall get into more contemporary stuff. Go ahead and start recording. Okay, I didn't hear the recording lady, but I'm assuming it's recording. Excellent. So now we are going to be looking at the children's Gothic and really getting into how contemporary literature today is using this, because that is my main focus of interest, is contemporary children's Gothic. So this is where we get a bit more interesting personally for me. So again, children's Gothic, as I've been saying, there's the notion that this is based in somewhat of an oral tradition in terms of these storytelling practices, and also in terms of folklore and myths that are said orally initially. So children's literature is seen as a genre, as a space that reflects societal and cultural changes, whereas children's Gothic hones in specifically on the anxieties that arise from these changes. And I quote, "It is a genre that presents us with structural consistencies and accommodates historical change, innovations, and appropriations that suit it to new anxieties, and an ethics that boldly challenges our cherished beliefs about childhood, and especially about what is appropriate for the child." So I've got Buckley. I always pronounce names wrong, so I apologize in advance. But Buckley, who states that horror, in fact, provides a psychic function, allowing children to grow, develop their creativity, and ultimately subvert ideologies of the children's literature from the past 150 years. And she boldly goes on to state that in this way, Gothic fiction will save our children. So it's, especially in phrasing it like that, I think it's really interesting, because it's almost a lesson in, it's got that lesson aspect of those older Victorian texts, but it's a lesson in challenging ideologies and understanding and facing difficult emotions, rather than avoiding them and just completely stripping them from the narrative. So it's the return of the Gothic, sort of, at least initially. So there's Gothic traces that can be located in various strands of children's fiction during the 19th century, but there's no discrete Gothic fiction for children that really exists at the time. Again, it's the Gothic elements that are brought into children's literature and other sorts of genres. Gothic as a genre itself largely is looked at and read by adults. However, it is important to note that a lot of children were able to read those books as well if they had the literacy to do so. So there were children who were reading, the Mysteries of Adolfo. That's the one. That is quite a popular one. And I think to myself now, wow, if a child read that, I'd be quite impressed. But so we have penny dreadfuls, which are the sort of serial literature that is usually costs about 1 penny, so relatively cheap, and they are initially produced for the enjoyment of adults, but end up being seen as more of a childish, not necessarily even a genre, but just a childish literature to be engaging with. So it was associated very quickly with children, and children who were interested in those more spooky, Gothic, supernatural tales. And as you can see on the cover of this one here, the price she paid, and what do we have but potentially a child death or dead. I don't like saying the words dead child. Child death seems a little bit softer to me for some reason. But so we've got the emergence of a genre of children's literature that expands beyond simply providing an educational or moralizing lesson to children, but also has the inclusion of texts that provide a heightened sense of entertainment for children. So penny dreadfuls were really full entertainment value. That's what they were looking to succeed at in regards to their audience. They wanted their audience to be entertained. Nevertheless, good influence are, of course, still of a paramount importance at this time, but Gothic elements become more widely accepted in children's literature, especially more so than horror, which seems to always have a bit of a pushback. But the Gothic itself was seen as a more legitimized genre to be including within children's literature. And we can even see this sort of idea of Gothic being preferred over horror, because horror was at the time sort of viewed almost as, well, it was viewed as having no place in children's literature, again, within this idea of wanting to have appropriate, controlling appropriate text for your child to read, but it was viewed as potentially contributing to the negative societal woes of the time. So if we think of it in terms of even mirroring present day, an example that I kind of came up with in my head is the anxieties of adults regarding the dangers presented by children or young people playing violent video games. We have this idea that for some reason engaging with horrific or violent media is going to have this effect on our mind and on our persons. It's almost like we haven't completely gotten rid of Locke. There's this niggling in the back of the brain that's just saying, oh no, we shouldn't be letting children do this or that. They're going to watch it and then decide to be violent as well after playing a video game, which we know there's varying science on that, and I will not get into it because that's a bit of a tangent. But we're going to go on to the next slide. So as we move onwards into the 20th century, death is no longer depicted as the path to immortality or an endless idealized childhood. It was previously seen that the idea of child death was maintaining the child's innocence with a queer sense of beauty to the early untimely loss of life, almost desirable. But instead, it becomes viewed as an unnatural event that is to be regretted. And I might have some of you already thinking, well, I know of some books that like really play to being immortality as desirable, and we'll get to that once we get to YA, so keep those thoughts in your head. But beyond child death, contemporary texts begin to address the grief and loss from the perspective of the child. So this is a really important one, especially in relation to processing grief with the loss of parents or grandparents. Is a common theme that we get within children's literature. And Buckley goes on to say that we are currently not in a golden age, but a Gothic age in children's literature. And we can definitely see that when we go into, you know, your Waterstones or local independent bookshop. There are those Gothic tales on the shelves for children, middle grade, teens, YA, you name it, it's going to be there somewhere. So what I want to do is actually take a look at some of these texts. So it's going to be a bit of a quick round because I wanted to show a variety of different representations of death within these texts. So we're going to start off with Dahl's The Witches, and this was published in 1985. And in this particular book, which I actually only read for the first time maybe 3 years ago or something like that, it was for my uni course, and I read it and I thought, oh, would I let my children read this? Because I thought to myself, oh wow, this is quite intense in terms of, I mean, there's definitely problems to the book as well in some of the representation that it has, but the ending was not at all what I expected. And I'm going to read particularly what I mean. And I'm reading it from a book. It's not on the screen just because it was a little bit too long. So you get to hear me read it out loud. This is after, of course, Boy has been turned into a mouse by the witches. He goes, "How long?" I asked. "Well, an ordinary mouse only lives for about 3 years, his grandmother said. But you are not an ordinary mouse. You are a mouse person, and that is a very different matter." "How different?" I asked. "How long does a mouse person live, Grandmama?" "Longer," she said, "much longer. A mouse person will almost certainly live for 3 times as long as an ordinary mouse," my grandmother said. "About 9 years." "Good," I cried. "That's great. It's the best news I've ever had." "Why do you say that?" she asked, surprised. "Because I would never want to live longer than you," I said. I couldn't stand being looked after by anybody else. There was a short silence. She had a way of fondling me behind the ears with the tip of one finger. It felt lovely. "How old are you, Grandmama?" I asked. "I'm 86, she said. "Will you live another 8 or 9 years? "I might," she said, "with a bit of luck." "You've got to," I said, "because then I'll be a very old mouse and you'll be a very old grandmother, and soon after that, we'll both die together." "That would be perfect," she said. So, as we can see with that reading, this is an example of an avoidance in terms of not an avoidance of death, but an avoidance of living, an avoidance of experiencing grief and loss. Instead, death is desired, and it almost mirrors this notion of a good, joyful child death, in that the boy has already decided to himself, well, it would be wonderful for me to just be able to live with Grandmama as a mouse, and then I can pass away at the same time, so I never have to experience being without her. So Boy decides to stay in the form of a mouse so that he will not outlive his grandmother. And as Nico Lejeva points out, to tell young readers you can escape growing up by dying is dubious, both an ideological and an aesthetic flaw. And there are many connotations within that. And you can see how that in reality, when you stop and you think about what the implications are of this boy's decision, that's a very strong representation of death in terms of an avoidance of wanting to accept it and the accepting the reality of it, and accepting the aging process in particular, and how it can be especially difficult for young people to understand what exactly death means. So we're going to move from the witches to the series of unfortunate events. Now, this is one in which we have an experience of grief. Now, it starts off from the very beginning. If you haven't read the series, I don't think it's a spoiler. They're orphans. So they start off with finding out that their parents have died. And a really interesting quote that comes up is this one here, and it says, "It's useless for me," this is the narrator speaking, Lemony Snicket, "It is useless for me to describe to you how Violet, Claus, and even Sunny felt in the time that followed the news of their parents' death. If you have ever lost someone very important to you, then you already know how it feels. If you haven't, you cannot possibly imagine it." So again, it's providing a shared experience for the reader who has experienced loss, but also it's showing that these are difficult emotions. And within this quote, the longer format of it, it goes on to explain how the children couldn't do the things that, you know, they normally found joy in. They were staying in bed. Even Sunny, who couldn't understand what death was biting with less enthusiasm. Remember, Sunny really likes to bite things. So it's this internalized effect on not just processing the grief and what they've gone through, but it affects their ability to live how they normally have lived, not in terms of necessarily even their own home and that, but in terms of the sudden effect it has on their creativity, imagination, focus. That's a really good example of how children's literature is starting to begin to help children potentially experience and process grief, whether that be, even if you haven't experienced, it says you can't possibly imagine, but you can almost try to imagine it. It's one of those things where you go, well, no, I couldn't possibly imagine, but there, you have that same sort of visceral reaction almost inside of you, just in terms of thinking about it. And there are other texts, of course, that do this really well as well. We have Neil Gaiman and the Graveyard Book, which is the total flip side. And this is something which is really celebrating, although Bod lives in a graveyard and is surrounded by a community of ghosts, and ghosts are seen as friendly and lovely, and why wouldn't you want to be a ghost? The adults are the ones who are terrifying and want to kill you. But this book is all about learning to live life. And you see at the end of the novel as well, one of the last sentences of it in terms of Bod going out to live his life, and life is capitalized. A lot of the times we can see death capitalized almost as though it's a character, whereas hardly ever you see life capitalized. And it makes you think a little bit more about that, of how perhaps embracing life also means that you're aware of the other half of that, and you're aware of death. And of course, Bod is very familiar with that. And it kind of is summed up in this little poem here that's towards the end of the book, that's actually sung by his mother, or ghostly mother. And again, one of the main things that pops out from here is, face your life, its pain, its pleasure, leave no path untaken. So it's that encouragement of, you know, it can be difficult. There's going to be times of pain in terms of loss and such, but what you need to do is live your life. And when there's the gray lady who comes on her horse, who is essentially the, you know, representation of death within this particular novel, she goes, it's not, you know, everybody will ride with me one day, but today essentially is not your day. There's a lot more life to give. So there's such a vast array of how death is represented within different novels for children. And then we come to one of my favorite ones. This one might not be as familiar to you all. So if you haven't heard of it, I hope this might encourage you to pick it up because it is very, very good. But this is City of Ghosts by Victoria Schwab, or V.E. Schwab. And this book really shows childhood as being a liminal space. So childhood is neither, you know, it's you have no control over your body, but you do have some control over your body. You're not yet an adult, but especially when you're thinking in terms of childhood, you're not a baby, so you have some independence and things like that. And in terms of this particular text, there's also the ghosts, which are just a daily occurrence for this particular character. And of course, ghosts exist within a liminal space, being both dead and somewhat alive. So within this tale, Cass, the main character, is rescued from death, pulled from it by Jacob, the ghost of a boy who is already dead. So she is saved by somebody who's already dead, who is then sort of attached to her, if you will. And she can see death as a veil, and it can be peeled back and peered beyond. And because Cass has had a not only near-death experience, but she has died, she can travel between because she is existing within this liminal state. She has had one foot on the side of death and one foot on the side of life. And at times throughout the novels, she exists as more alive, and at others more dead. So there's also within this text an inability of ghosts to look at themselves in the mirror, which is very interesting. And it's playing on that, once again, this idea of an avoidance of the knowledge of death, particularly an avoidance of the knowledge of one's own death in this situation. So ghosts within, as I said, this text can't look into mirrors because it reflects their true self. So here in this quote, we have Jacob, who has unfortunately found himself staring into a mirror. And there are two Jacobs, the one beside me and the one in the mirror, but they're not the same. The Jacob beside me is the one I know, but the one in the mirror is grayed out and gaunt, his shirt and jeans soaked, rivered water pooling at his feet. The Jacob in the mirror looks, I stop. I don't let myself think the word. So again, not only is there an avoidance in terms of Jacob himself not wanting to recognize the fact that he is dead, because when he's not looking them in the mirror, he does not have that imagery. He looks just like a little bit of a, ghosty boy, not as spooky as Cass would say, but also Cass's avoidance of wanting to acknowledge the fact that her ghost friend is in fact a ghost friend and thus dead. It's not news to her, but it's almost like a confrontation that she's not ready to make. And we see this throughout the novel and towards the end, when there's this notion of ghosts need to be moving on, and if they stay within our realm, they're going to get stronger. And thinking, well, does she want him to move on, or does she want him to stay? Because to her, it's her best friend, and she doesn't want to have that grief of losing him. So even though he's already dead, there's still this extra added layer of you can still lose this person. And this is where hauntology comes into play a lot within children's literature. So hauntology, very briefly, because I'm sure probably a lot of you have already heard about it, was first introduced by Derrida in 1993. And it's the idea that a society's cultural past haunts its present through ghostly hauntings. So it questions and challenges the very foundations of which our identities are built upon. And it asks us, how does our past already haunt our futures? So in terms of looking at the idea of a past, especially in terms of children's literature affecting the future, we can already see that in a lot of children's literature today in terms of failings by adults in society in terms of the next future generation, but also in terms of things such as colonialism and other oppressive situations that have occurred throughout history, and how children's literature is addressing those things as well. So Botting says that addressing questions of politics, futurity, and history requires for Derrida consideration of the structure of the transformed nature of the event, the mark of historical discontinuity, sustaining the possibility of something new to come, an arrivante, unpredictable, new, incalculable, and even monstrous. So again, it's this notion that no matter how hard we try, the past will ultimately catch up to us. So again, ghosts occupy a liminal space, and children do as well. But it's a fundamentally nostalgic move, as Buckley says, for contemporary children's Gothic to return to the past, even as it tries to claim to move the literature forward. So like I say, in terms of looking at the future of children's Gothic, there's the already immediately the effect of the past on it. You can't split one from the other. So in order to progress, you still have to acknowledge and engage with that past. So spectral children who in diverse ways interact with history by rewriting past wrongs committed or experienced by adults. Gothic fictions for young people mobilize ghostly children to critique or remedy adult actions, often expressing distrust in adults and authority figures. And this is seen in terms of, again, the failures of adults in protecting children and providing a safe childhood, as well as recognizing past injustices inflicted on minorities, calling out lasting prejudices. And one of the examples of this, which I don't have a full close analysis of, is Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, and the notion that these children are trapped within this time loop because of World War II, and if the time loop stopped, they would be hit and destroyed by the bomb. And so technically they are dead, but they are also not dead. They are existing within this liminal space, and they are trying to rewrite their own lives despite the failures, not necessarily of adults, because we do have, of course, Miss Peregrine, who is a notable adult and one who protects the children in terms of their safety and well-being, but in terms of the larger society as a whole and the disregard for life, especially children's lives. So this is all part of a discourse that seeks to Gothicize childhood as a site of trauma, as well as one that wants to celebrate and the Gothic possibilities of childhood. So although there is trauma within childhood, there's also that possibility for change and transformation by challenging those ideologies that the Gothic is so good at challenging. So what I want to do here is particularly look at two clips from a animated, it's a not 3D animation, 2D animation film called The Last Unicorn. And there's two clips because I want you, I saw some happy claps. I'm very glad. It's one of my favorite films. But the first clip that I'm going to show you here is, here, we'll show the clip and then I'll do some talking. How about that? If I can get it to work. I need to. That I'm going to show in terms of understanding that. Thanks. I was going to say living in the Highlands. So in terms of this clip, it's a precursor for the next clip that we're going to be watching. And it's to understand how the Lady Almathia, who is the woman in this clip, she is the last unicorn. She is shapeshifted magic into a woman, and she has come with the purpose of trying to find the rest of her kind who, as we have learned here, have been forced into the ocean or into the sea. Now, this is 1982. This comes post World War II. There are various interpretations that can be apply to the claiming of the unicorns, including such things as the Holocaust, colonialism, the oppression of women. There's a lot of things that can be playing into this notion of the beauty and the grace that is wanted and desired by this one particular man who has the power to gain it. And there's this consumeristic obsession to the point of a cultural death that we see with King Herod here, or Haggard here, sorry, in that he wants the unicorns to such an extent that he wants every single last one of them, and he is willing to kill the culture, kill the species of the unicorn, and not have it exist as it once did in order to satisfy his desire. So it's a very interesting take on death in terms of moving beyond just the individual and looking at culture or society as a whole, or in this case, unicorns. So Lady Althama is the last unicorn, and she seeks the knowledge of her history despite the danger of dying. So as we recognize here within this clip, King Herod is saying how he recognizes her for what he is, for what she is. And this places her in grave danger because, of course, he wants every single last one. And this is where the second clip comes into play. So I will.
Happy.
Sorry. So just to summarize a little bit at the end of that was ultimately the unicorns come out onto the shore and they end up stampeding essentially the castle down, and King Herod falls and is assumed to be dead. So in true Gothic form, there is a pushback here in this scene, a fight against the literal boundaries that have been imposed on the unicorn. So she is, within that very boundary between the land and the sea. And in challenging these unjust systems, not only is she able to save herself, but she's able to free all of her kind, an entire society, a culture resurrected from the very depths. So instead, the villain falls to his death and all is right in the world. And, unicorns exist again. So that's a major bonus on my part. And the next section is going to be section 3. If everybody's okay with it, I can just go right into it because I'm very conscious of time. So if everybody's happy with that, yeah, excellent. This is, again, the one with a lot of trigger warnings, so just be wary of that. So in terms of moving into more, I can't even say more contemporary children's literature, but the new emergence of this further split within it in terms of the genres of age categorizations really coming into play, but a major one being YA, young adult fiction. And I want to touch on Harry Potter here because it's very important to understand how the series shifted children's literature in terms of the emergence of YA. And Jackson sums it up very well for me here in saying that in 1997, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was published in the UK, marketed for children aged 9 to 11. Those children who were young adults by the time the last book was published in 2007. The original readers had grown up almost in sync with Harry himself. And furthermore, when we look at the books themselves, we can see that evolution in writing style. You can see that from book 1 to 3, it's very much a children's book. They're small, not a whole lot of, it's not small text in there. They're very geared towards children, whereas progressively as the reader gets older, we're seeing that shift as a generation followed the story and that writing style shifted with it. So by the end of the Harry Potter series, we're getting a much more adult level fiction that's coming into play. And we see a similar experience in regards to the actors of the film franchise who went through childhood and subsequent transition into adulthood during the years of filming. So it's a really interesting play of how the the decade sort of long journey that this took, and how that writing shifted to be something that was creating a new space for those readers who grew up with the Harry Potter series. And Anna Jackson argues that Harry Potter books are the 20th century's most successful Gothic publishing phenomena. Whether you agree with that or not, it is a very interesting statement to consider in terms of how Gothic the Harry Potter series are. And there are many representations of death. I mean, I've, picture up here, but I'm not going to go into a close analysis of the Harry Potter series today. If anybody wants to talk more about it, I'm open to discussion, but for the purpose of today's video, I didn't feel it was necessary. And it's mostly just to note how it was a key development in the formation of YA fiction as we know it today. Oh, sorry, left a little bit of yellow there. Very important quote. So in terms of teen and YA fiction, it is a cultural construction. Once again, this is based on our culture in which we have this extended adolescence almost. I know people don't, young adult, in terms of how people are staying in school longer. So in terms of youth being defined as 15 to 24, that's inclusive of university age as well. So we can really see how much of a shift has come into play from the beginnings of children's literature to now. And Hannah Priest notes that there's further confusion by the added abbreviation of YA to the young adult, because it removes any clear indicator of either youth or adult. It's just YA. So if you don't know what that stands for, you're a little bit in trouble. But it does take away that it's good and has problems with it in terms of if you're specifically seeking out that type of material. But by removing the young adult, it makes it more open for a wider audience, despite that it's geared towards a specific audience when you're looking at the title in full. So the traditions of the Gothic genre are repurposed and reconfigured in contemporary fiction for young adults to reflect on the importance of their future possibilities, as well as their present modes of existence and possible resistance. And the possible resistance is a big one. So there's a boom of Gothic within YA in particular, because we can see it in the reflection of growing anxieties within our youth culture and our unpredictable futures. There's again this transgression of boundaries and restrictions, and this gearing towards a possible resistance against the structures that have a negative influence on the future of youth. So so an awareness of mortality as a defining factor is crucial in the YA genre. There's a dichotomy of death, contrasting kinds, avoidance and transformative versus confronting and acceptance. And arguably both are transformative in different ways, but one is inward looking and one is external. And we will look at those two specific kinds of representations of death in a moment. But I want to just take a brief second to look at this little diagram. I don't really know if I'd call it a diagram, but showing this splitting of how children's literature is today. We've got children's literature, sometimes it even is defined as picture books, and then we've got middle grade, which again is usually around ages 9 to 11, I think, roughly. Then we have our teen fiction and young adult, which teen fiction and young adult tend to blend together at a certain point as well. And I've sort of taken some of the texts that we've been looking at today and put them where I kind of feel like they might fit within those categorizations, but ultimately they are all children's literature or children's and young person's literature. But I've got a special note here in terms of a book called This Savage Song, and this is by the author V. Schwab. Once again, amazing book, and specifically looking at anxiety. It's very Gothic, it's got monsters in it, but it's looking at the anxieties of essentially violence and gun laws and school shootings in terms of America and the realities that adolescents face in that particular culture. And it's interesting to note this because that is a real lived reality for those adolescents in America. And this Savage song is marketed as YA in America, but in the UK, it's advertised as adult fiction. And it was written as YA. So it's interesting to see how bringing it over here has changed it as being almost saying, maybe that's not appropriate to be YA. Maybe that needs to be an adult read. So it's interesting to see how these shifts based on, as it is, it's a cultural construction and the cultures determine what is within those boundaries. So we're going to look at a clip here from Twilight. This is the one that has an emaciated body. So if you don't want to see that, please click off for the next, I think it's maybe 3 minutes. So if you want to do a link, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know what works best for you. I think it's just, I have really bad internet connection, so I'm holding my phone by the window when I play the clips. So the important bit to think about just in terms of towards the end of the film, I just didn't want to have to go through the whole reminiscent scene of, life flashing before her eyes. But that ultimately, before she awakens and you see her red eyes, is that her heart, you kind of notice heartbeat throughout, and it's helped with the little subtitles, but before she awakens, her heart stops. And therefore, she has completed the transformation in that she is dead and she is immortal, but she reawakens as a vampire. I don't know how to get out of this. I may have backed myself into a corner by doing this a full screen one, because I can't see my little, oh, if I push exit, it's going to take me out of the entire PowerPoint, isn't it? It doesn't completely mess up my. So in terms of Twilight and the representations of death that we've just looked at, this is a temporary and transformational death in a sense. I mean, she is a vampire and she's immortal, so her death is permanent in that sense, but it's not because she is obviously alive as a vampire. So Priest argues that in many of these fictions, the heroine herself dies symbolically or literally, and may even die on multiple occasions. It is almost to be expected that YA fiction will represent feminine death. And there's an understanding here that the character must die in order to gain self-awareness and rediscover the self, coming to terms with one's true identity and its subsequent potential. Again, we see this as a sort of liminal space of transition, as neither child nor adult in terms of YA, and in terms of this transformational death being neither dead nor fully alive. Now, there is a problematic aspect of presenting death as temporary and only aiding in the progression towards adulthood rather than causing the cessation of this progress. Like this notion of you have to die in some way to become an adult or to progress to that next stage of your life, rather than the fact that if you were to die at that point, it would cease that journey. It's problematic in that in extreme cases, there's this avoiding of both adulthood and death entirely. So we see that with Bella's transformation and her gained immortality. We also see this with the peculiar children in Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, where they are essentially being able to avoid death, but also avoiding adulthood by being in this time loop. And the notion that if they were to leave this, they would then, the time would rapidly catch up with them and they would age to the point where they would then die. So there's this fear of aging and mortality. And there's also an example of this in terms of the Savage Song with August, who is a monster character who is born out of mass killings, essentially, is what these monsters are born out of. And he is reborn in the same body, not body, but at the same age as the person who committed this act. And so he is a 12-year-old but has the maturity of somebody much older and has to go through that sort of progress. So the ways in particular with Twilight, the ways in which later fiction and film reference Twilight franchise establish Mayer's work as a locus classicus, as Priest describes it, of contemporary teen Gothic. So, we were talking about, I don't know, I've got strikes through this either, goodness me. Sorry about that. So we can see when we're thinking about Harry Potter and how that has had a crucial role in terms of the development of YA, we also see this coming from texts such as Twilight that clearly had a huge impact on YA fiction, and particularly the inclusion of a dark romance, Gothic romance element within YA that was largely kind of shied away from, and further allowing the transformational exploration of sexuality and all that other fun stuff that you get to go through at that age. And now we're going to look at the other type of death, and that is going to be viewed through a clip from The Hunger Games. Trigger warning for this one, it is a on-scene child death. If you haven't seen it before, it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to see it. If you have seen it before and you don't want to watch it, that's a-okay, but we will be watching it in full, and I will just wait until you. So in terms of that clip, it is a very heavy one, and it is one that you don't see often. It's very rare that you see child death on screen, especially not like in a horror film. That's a little bit different, but even that tends to be avoided a lot of the time. So it's really less common for this permanent real death in both children's literature and film compared to the temporary transformational one. So it's interesting to consider the fact that child death, especially in terms of this, is no longer viewed as joyful. We can understand that very clearly. This is not a joyful death of preserved innocence. Instead, it is understood as a grotesque and exceptional and unfair, unjust horror, only to be regretted and mourned. There is no celebration of Rue's death. Instead, the solemn ceremony that Katniss lays out later on in Flowers emphasizes not the preserved innocence of a child, but the absolute loss of innocence. And I think that's a really important shift to be thinking about. And there's again this notion that adults have failed to protect the children within the arena. Not just Katniss has failed to protect Rue, because Katniss is a child too. It is the adults who have failed to protect the children within the arena, and instead of doing so, indulge in this failure and continue its perpetuation. And it's interesting, there was an article that I was reading by Moffat and May who were looking at it in terms of how there's no real way out of death in this in the series, both in terms of the books and the films, because once they step into that arena, they have to kill in order to survive. And so there's no ability to break away from death. It's either kill or be killed. And as we see here, it's not even necessarily the death of oneself, but of others. So Katniss has not died, but she is experiencing the grief of a loss of somebody else who she deeply cares about. And unlike other characters beyond like an orphan status. Katniss does not have the opportunity to avoid death, and that's neither her own or that of others, and that's all down to the Hunger Games, because after all, death rules the Hunger Games. In Katniss's inability to escape death as a witness, death has shaped her identity, and in this way may also have the effect of confronting readers with their own mortality as well. So as you, as the reader, are reading through the deaths, not only of the other members within the arena, but especially within this scene, you're kind of reflecting on your own human mortality as well. And this, in terms of YA, again, helps, even though it's a potentially more difficult one to approach, it again helps us have a better relationship and understanding of death, rather than this complete avoidance and idea of it being temporary, and almost kind of tricking ourselves into believing that it doesn't apply to us. So this is a much more realistic relationship with death, despite it being much more sad. So now we're going to finish off our talk with this idea of the future, and I'd be particularly interested in hearing other people's thoughts on this. So in terms of death's future in children's Gothic, I think it's important to consider how, again, this is a space in which cultural shifts are being looked at and criticized. So with this new access to a range of media, it changes, one, the reading habits of children in terms of the accessibility of the internet and other means, but also there's the importance of a future is particularly salient in YA Gothic, where the haunting appears in the form of an awareness of the future and the challenges that face the youth protagonists as they move into adulthood. So there's a clear notion that potentially looking at how society today and the impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic and the drawing in almost of death, in terms of it being a much more closer reality to our everyday, and especially considering that children will have experienced death in a way that they wouldn't have before, potentially in losing their grandparents or parents to this disease and not being able to be with them. That's another really important thing to consider in terms of the future of children's Gothic, is how is this isolated death potentially going to come up and come into play in terms of a process of emotions. But on top of that, we also have, of course, the climate crisis, and even now with the sort of hovering threat of a nuclear war that continues to just go into absolute chaos. But what are all of these anxieties about a future that seems so fragile in terms of things that children cannot control and that they shouldn't expect to be trying to control? You know, these are things that are out of their control, but also, more importantly, these are things that are potentially considered as a failure, or I would consider it as a failure anyways, of the adult generation before them in terms of climate crisis and a failure to act on that. And we've seen children mobilize in terms of, you know, protesting and asking for action on that to the best of their ability, but they can only do so much. And it's holding the adults to account. But in terms of the literature, how that past will become represented in the future literature that we will see. Now, I do always like to end on a hopeful note. So it's important to remember that there, strangely enough, is hope in death. So children's Gothic, especially within YA, is a transformative genre. It's not only for the characters and the readers themselves, but it has far-reaching implications in the real world. If you consider the impact of the Hunger Games and the use of the fictional sign of resistance in real protest, that transgression and pushback on boundaries and inequalities and injustices does bleed into our everyday society and can make a difference. I don't think that the Gothic is for nothing. So there's a definite potential within this chaos and this time of what seems like death hovering over our society, there is a chance for transformation. It's almost like that temporary transformational death, rather than focusing on a permanent, absolute death of a culture that no longer works. So there is space for movement and hope and transformation. And as Moffat and May say, I'll leave you with this quote. It says, "A new world that does not hide from horror that has come before, but rather confronts it in order to learn from the past errors." And that is what I think Hope in Death shows us in terms of YA Gothic and children's Gothic in general. It hopes that we can understand that the hauntings of our past will lead us towards a better future, and that we can learn from those mistakes because we are not able to hide from them. And that is the conclusion of my talk. I realize I've got very little time for questions, but I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer. These are just references. If anybody wants me to send them a copy of references, there's a lot of them, and further readings, I am more than happy to do so. And again, just that fun little collage. And you can find out more about my research on my Ko-fi page. So thank you again so much for joining me tonight.